Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you're having a good week. I know that many of you are taking exams and writing papers, so I empathize with you if you're feeling very busy and a little underwater, so to speak. But if you're here and you're ready to get back into it, I'm very happy to see you, and I hope that you do feel energetic and ready to do this because we're having a very important discussion about voter turnout. And, turnout is so essential because every vote counts. And we talked about how in a majoritarian system, a single vote can change everything. In a proportional representation system, small parties that represent views that might otherwise go without representation can get seats if more people vote. We talked about how votes count and mobilizing voters is a really important factor in driving up participation. And what I wanted to communicate to you is that participation matters because elections have consequences and policy agendas are endorsed or rejected based upon how many people go out and vote and how decisively they communicate their preferences by punishing the incumbent or awarding them or putting someone else in power. These are really important choices. And I talked to you about how in the United States, extremist views tend to benefit from low voter turnout. And the establishment or the status quo is a beneficiary of low voter turnout because the voting public is overwhelmingly moderate and they're often desiring or favorable to changes or progressive policy changes that would be good for ordinary people and that might be hostile to the beneficiaries of these rules that have been in place for so long. In Europe, it's something similar. Extremist parties and populist parties on the far right are the beneficiaries of low voter turnout because they have smaller constituencies and smaller electoral bases. They can mobilize those supporters very effectively, but because they have fewer voters and fewer supporters, it becomes really essential that turnout in general is low so that they can mobilize their supporters in large numbers and effectively outpunch the masses, so to speak. But if voter turnout is very high, in those large moderate voters turn out in large numbers, those extremist parties and candidates fare far less well. And in the most recent elections in 2019, there were European Parliament elections and then, of course, national elections as well. And in those elections, in the run up to those elections, analysts feared that if voter turnout was low and if populist parties on the far right effectively mobilized their supporters, there could be a really devastating result. In particular, they feared that populist parties on the far right could form a bloc that obtained larger than 33% of the vote share in the European Parliament, and that if they were united and coherent, that they could really wreak damage and wreak havoc. And in this way, Europe's fate was sort of held up as hanging in the balance and depending on voter turnout. Now, what actually happened in that election? Well, voter turnout was more robust than they anticipated. And the outcome was relatively good from the vantage point of sort of suppressing those extremist elements that are so antagonistic to solidarity, equality, and those values of virtue and um, civic cooperation that we associate with democracy more generally. But there was a real fear that a united bloc of populist parties, if they obtained a larger than 33% vote share, could block sanctions against rogue states or states like Poland or Hungary. They could paralyze EU budget negotiations. They could scuttle trade deals that were designed to integrate Europe more deeply with the rest of the world. They could do a lot of damage, and they could work against the larger effort to promote cooperation and egalitarianism and democracy. So in that election in 2019, turnout was about 51%, still dismal, to be clear, still quite dismal and quite low by any standard, but it was actually higher than the turnout in 2014, which was 43%. In 1979, the turnout was 62%, much higher than even in 2019. So you get a sense then that over time, voter turnout in the European Parliament has declined substantially, and that from election to election, it can vary considerably, but that it still does have important consequences. You know, if voter turnout had been lower, and if these populist parties had been effective at mobilizing their supporters, it could have produced an outcome along these lines. But as it were, turnout was higher, and in addition, it was also the case that many of those populist elements and parties have been unable to cooperate effectively internally. And so that coalition and that bloc has been less coherent than was originally anticipated before 2019. But this is just a vignette to give you a sense of what hangs sort of at stake and what could go wrong if people don't turn out to elections and don't go and participate and go and vote on election day. On a national level, populist and far right parties also performed um, well, more or less well. You know, some countries like Hungary and Italy and France saw populist politicians and parties surge to victory, and others really gave their populist candidates and parties the boot. Italy is an example of a country where a populist leader and party did come to victory. The deputy prime minister and the leader of the League Party, Matteo Salvini, is the figure that maybe you've seen before in maybe the media or on the cover of the newspaper. Italy is just one example. Le Pen in France is another. Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are all examples of these leaders that are hostile to democratic values, at least the kinds of values that we talked about before: solidarity, egalitarianism, etc. And so when you think about voter turnout, you got to think about who benefits from low voter turnout and who benefits from high voter turnout. And generally speaking, extremist parties and far right parties, or theoretically, far left parties or extremist parties in any regard of any vantage point or slant, those are typically the beneficiaries of low turnout because they can mobilize their supporters, and there aren't enough ordinary voters to counterbalance that narrow but very vocal minority. The beneficiaries of high voter turnout are going to be those more moderate parties, and those parties and third parties that may do a better job at representing a diversity of interests without, doing unnecessary violence to those values of democracy and egalitarianism and solidarity and civic virtue, et cetera, that we come to associate with democracy. So voter turnout matters. It really, really, really does. And I gave you the example before about how in the local elections in the United States, voter turnout is as low as could be. You know, sometimes 15, 20% of eligible voters turn out to vote in those elections. And so when you consider that, it's almost mind-boggling to think about how narrow and how tiny the constituency that actually elects those leaders is in those communities and in those situations. And if you think about it and you compare it to, say, the size of the electorate in, say, the most repressive and most authoritarian of dictatorships, it's very similar. And so leaders in Saudi Arabia depend upon the support of a group that's about the same size or proportion of the overall constituency as the a constituency that elects some of the leaders in local elections in the United States, just to give you a sense of how low turnout is and how that affects the outcome. So the big picture is that turnout matters, and it can vary considerably. And low voter turnout tends to benefit extremist parties and candidates. High voter turnout tends to benefit much more moderate parties and candidates. And in a more general regard, we associate turnout with democracy. Obviously, the vote we've already established as being the single most important act in a democratic political system, either by a legislator or a citizen. The casting of a vote is the communication in the registering of a preference, right? In a kind of institutional way. You're participating in the system and you're registering your attitude or your preference. And in this way, voter turnout has always been associated with democratic performance. As early as 1982, Bingham Powell, excuse me, called turnout one of three dimensions of democratic performance, along with government stability or transfers from one administration to another or regime from one regime to another. Excuse me, can't talk today. As well as political order and rule of law and this sort of thing. Voter participation and electoral participation, especially, was considered essential to performance because it was an act and a behavior that had to be engaged in on a regular, repeated basis. And to perform and to engage in the act of democracy was to vote and to participate. And citizens were the ones who hold that power and that responsibility from the perspective of Powell. And so more generally, turnout matters and is a part of democratic performance and the way we could think about a democracy performing or behaving and functioning in a way that a democracy does. So at this point, you should be asking, what if affects turnout? And if it matters so much, and if turnout is part of performance and the functioning of democracy, what factors should affect turnout and what would contribute to or go into variation from country to country in turnout, and maybe in particular from advanced democracy to advanced democracy, those old democracies that have lots of electoral experience and where citizens have voted in lots and lots of elections over the course of many generations, and where there's a lot of political learning and where turnout should be understood as being important to democracy. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do that same little activity that I did with you on Monday, and we're going to work through this together. So you should be seeing a Word document that has two questions: what factors affect voter turnout? And why is voter turnout higher in some countries than others? And I think the best way for us to do this and the best way to get started is to just do some brainstorming and think about, why would turnout vary? Why do some countries have higher turnout than others? Is there anything that we can pinpoint that might be relevant and that could get us started? We're getting a lot of contributions in the chat. But before I go to that, does anyone want to make a comment, and I'll take notes while we listen?
One reason could be electoral law, as we're seeing in the United States. Uh, the 2020 election allowed more absentee voting, excuse voting, as well as drop boxes, which led to significantly higher turnout relative to previous years.
Okay, so rules around absentee voting and mail-in voting, drop boxes. When you provide more avenues for voting, more people vote. That seems really straightforward and logical. And especially with regard to, say, like mail-in voting, especially during, say, a pandemic, when people would have a reason to stay home and maybe an incentive to mail in a ballot. Absolutely. So, what else would matter?
In some countries, election day falls on a weekend, or it's just more accessible for some people to go out and vote because of the day.
And it's a holiday in some countries too. So, it makes it easier, especially for people who work, which is, presumably most people. It makes it difficult for them to get out and vote if it's not a holiday or if it doesn't take place on a weekend day. Absolutely. Again, the logic is straightforward. You need more people to vote. You make election day a holiday, or you make it so that voting takes place on a day when most people don't work. Great. That's something that we could observe from country to country, and we could see if that correlates with voter turnout. What else would matter?
um, I think that the process in which you register to vote is wrong. I'm pretty sure if it was in this class that we've seen that if like countries that automatically registered people to vote through the DMV seen higher voter turnout.
Absolutely. So this was a different class, but this is related. Automatic voter registration is a process that exists in most advanced countries, and it's been shown to be associated with much higher voter turnout. And the logic is straightforward. If you make it less cumbersome for people to register, and if you do it automatically as part of, say, applying for a driver's license or registering a car, um, they're much more likely to vote because they don't have to go through the hassle of registering or tracking down documents, etc. And so again, the logic is straightforward. You make it easier to vote, people will vote in larger numbers. What else?
Just to add on, I think maybe what we can also think about is sometimes there's been a redirection of like funding, so that way there can be more like polling options for people in like lower income areas, or more information being sent out to those areas. So maybe that's like a factor in making sure like more people are voting.
Yeah. So it's been shown, for example, that when parties and candidates contact voters directly and when they convey information to them directly, it increases turnout. And it's intuitive that that would be the case because the relationship that voters have with the party already, either because of registration or past voting, might make them open to or inclined to be open to encouragement or information from candidates or parties that they align with already, perhaps more so than, say, a picketer or someone, just trying to register people on the street. That person is a good Samaritan, but it might be more meaningful for someone to respond to information provided to them by a party or a candidate. And this has been shown to be the case for all age groups, but of course you can imagine that some groups might be especially responsive to this kind of outreach. And those groups are often going to be particular, and maybe groups that don't vote in large numbers already. So young Latino men, for instance, are among the groups that vote in the smallest numbers. And there are many reasons for that. But you could imagine that strategies designed to inform those citizens could be very effective at increasing turnout in districts where those individuals disproportionately constitute voters. And so information and demographics play important roles and work together a lot when it comes to getting people to the polls. What else could we put down?
I think another thing we could also put down is the type of propaganda that's being kind of administered, or what social media is being used. Because I think definitely for this election, there was a lot of social media being used, so there was higher turnout because more people were able to see like the flyers and the videos. So I would definitely put like maybe whether it's negative or positive propaganda and what audience they were reaching.
It kind of sounded like you were describing the volume of media. Uh, and I wonder about, say, misinformation, and if misinformation influenced, say, voting or turnout. And for instance, I know that like the Republican Party voted in smaller numbers in the runoff elections in Georgia in February as compared to November. And one of the potential reasons is that there was some misinformation floating around about the the earlier race having been, rigged or set up or fixed. That misinformation can inform voters incorrectly and can discourage them from voting if they're led to believe that the vote won't count, or the race isn't legitimate, or the integrity of the process is up for debate. I think that you're right in general that the kind of appeal, or the kind of message that affects turnout. Misinformation is something that is obviously related to information processing, and the rational choice model of information processing that we're familiar with doesn't leave a lot of space for incorrect information or misinformation or conspiracy theory, does it? So it's interesting to think about how turnout and behavior would be affected by types of information and appeals that maybe weren't anticipated by those models. Is there anything else we can add to this list? Brittany says registration. Some countries have lower barriers to entry. Absolutely. Santiago says trust in government affects turnout. Alondra mentioned the polling places and access to voting. Voter ID laws have been shown to depress voter turnout. Samantha says clientelistic transfers in some countries increase turnout. Mandatory voting, says Chandon, does increase turnout. Long lines, says Santiago. But then again, some of the longest lines ever were observed in South Africa in 1994. And voter turnout in that election, that first all race election, swamped turnout in previous elections and has been still higher than most of the rates of turnout since. So I don't know if long lines necessarily depress turnout. Angelis mentions the election day as a holiday. Casey says age restrictions, ID requirements, same day registration. Loren says accessibility. Angelis says, like in Australia, yep, compulsory voting. Aiden says, the state the country is in, oh, the condition, so maybe the economic circumstances, or the whether they've just got out of a war. Okay, absolutely. Josette, can you elaborate regarding education, transportation? Do you mean the condition of those public goods? Jocelyn, oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think just like the resources, how like mentioning kind of going to like election day, like how available it is for people to go to it. And then education, I just think that people, when they usually have like more of the resources, or they like understand that it's important to go vote, then they will show up more.
Okay, absolutely. So the quality in the public goods, the ideas about voting, the cultural norms around voting. Brittany says government regimes may also matter. In some autocracies, they report really high voter turnout. Yeah, in some countries, some dictatorships, elections are just a complete sham. Yes, Virginia, absolutely. Mandatory voting is certainly a factor. And it sort of seems unfair to compare that, though, doesn't it? I always thought, it seems like in those cases, they should have the highest rates of voting of all, since it's required. But certainly that is a factor. Insatisfaction with the government is potentially a factor. I'm wondering, Alondra, do you think that dissatisfaction with the incumbent government would increase voter turnout, or do you think that that would depress voter turnout? Or do you think if they're satisfied with the incumbent, they would vote in larger numbers, or would they not vote? Grace says, can demographics play a factor? I'm curious in what ways. I think it certainly could. We'd have to think about how. So as you can all have pointed out, there are many, many factors that can potentially affect voter turnout. And this is the best place for us to start this discussion, because we first noticed that there might be any number of factors that differentiate turnout from one election to another inside a given country. There might also be factors that differentiate country to country and explain why one country has high voter turnout and another has low voter turnout. We might also differentiate between rates of turnout in different areas. There are many levels of analysis, and there are many different ways of analyzing variation in turnout across space, across time. And what I want to establish and show you is that some of the approaches to explaining variation across space don't do a good job explaining variation across time. And so we need all of these different perspectives and all of these different factors to understand how and why voter turnout can vary. And again, we're working on the assumption that we've established already that turnout matters a great deal, because there are beneficiaries of low turnout and beneficiaries of high turnout. And so we're going to work with the ideas that we've already generated, and we'll start to discuss some of the factors that we know cause voter turnout. The earliest study is from 1986, and it identifies two factors. The first one is how competitive the national districts are. The second factor is how strong the links are between social groups and political parties. In the United States, you've certainly heard about battleground states, swing states, or states where the races are closely contested and where voting becomes especially important because the state can alter the outcome of the election. This is a battleground state. This is a highly competitive district or a highly competitive state, if you will. Powell found that turnout is higher in countries that have more of those competitive districts and where national districts on the whole are highly competitive. In the United States, it varies considerably from state to state. As you can see here, there does appear to be a link between competitiveness and turnout. States that are more in the battleground category have higher voter turnout rates. Now, Powell was interested in variation from country to country, and he found the countries that have more competitive national districts on the whole also have higher rates of turnout. He also found that countries that have very close links between social groups and parties, say between the church and parties, between unions and parties, also have higher turnout. The idea was that those social groups communicate information and mobilize voters effectively and do a good job of linking parties to voters and getting them to the polls in favor of those parties. And so the implication is pretty straightforward. With this, we expect to find that where groups are tied to parties and races are closely contested, turnout should be higher. And where groups are not closely tied to parties and where races are not closely contested, turnout should be lower. And so in the United States, groups are not very closely tied to parties. I know it might seem like they are, but they're not as closely tied as they are in many other countries. And moreover, we only have so many battleground states. Most of the states are not swing states. Most of the states are essentially, well, they are always contested in the literal sense, but they're not closely contested and they're not highly competitive. Now that might be changing increasingly because states like North Carolina and others seem to be up for grabs. But the point is that when you think about these factors, we begin to understand why, say, the United States might have lower voter turnout, generally speaking, than a lot of, say, European countries, a lot of other countries where more races are closely contested and where, generally speaking, social groups are closely tied to political parties. Now, the article that I had you read for this week is probably the most important article in this entire literature. And it's still really the one that set the tone for the entire discussion. It remains the most important one today. And everything done since then has really been done in response to this piece. So that the 1987 article by Jackman addresses the same question. You know, why is voter turnout higher in some countries than in others, specifically among developed, advanced democracies? And Jackman takes a look at the same variables that Powell does, nationally competitive districts, and the group party linkages. Jackman finds that only nationally competitive districts are associated with higher voter turnout. There's no effect or no relationship, as he finds it, between group party linkages and voter turnout. But Jackman also finds that there's a role for four other institutional factors, and these include how proportional or disproportional the electoral system is. This relates to the extent to which seats are not divided up according to the proportion of the vote won by individual parties. So let me back up a little bit. I know that's confusing. A majoritarian electoral system, a single member district first past the post system, gives the entire constituency to the candidate who won the most votes. All other candidates are eliminated, regardless of how many votes they won. In this regard, a majoritarian system is highly disproportional because it effectively wastes or throws away all those votes. So a majoritarian system would be highly disproportional. Jackman says and found that that sort of a system depresses turnout because voters have the sense that their vote will be wasted if their candidate does not win. Now, a proportional representation system where there are multiple members or candidates or legislators in each district, and where seats are divvied up according to the proportion of the vote won by the party or candidate, it's much more proportional because fewer votes are quote unquote wasted because you're allocating seats according to the share won by individual parties. And so where the system is more proportional and where fewer votes are wasted and there's a closer fit between seats allocated and seats won, turnout should be higher because people ostensibly have a greater sense that their vote won't be wasted if the candidate that they voted for doesn't end up being the top vote getter in the race. This is essentially what Jackman discovered and found with regard to the role of proportionality. He also found that multipartism matters. And so where systems have more political parties, voter turnout is higher, ostensibly because they have more choices and because the system presents them with more opportunities and a wider set of interests that can be represented. He also found that unicameralism matters. This is the fact that some countries concentrate legislative power in a single legislative chamber. They've got one chamber. They don't have a House and Senate, they just have a legislature, period. He found that unicameralism increases voter turnout. The logic apparently is that when you have a bicameral legislature, citizens have the sense that the lower house is less important and they therefore vote less readily in elections for those lower houses. And then finally, compulsory voting. Jackman found that countries that have mandatory voting laws, laws that require citizens to vote, have higher turnout. Now, these are all relatively straightforward, and much of this is very intuitive. It is, however, somewhat narrow in its substantive view of turnout. It views turnout as essentially an institutional phenomenon. Now, think about what that implies. That implies that all societies are filled with people who have the same propensity to vote. The only thing that differs is the rules in the arrangements in the processes around voting and around the counting of votes and the translating of votes into seats. This is to say that no societies are more or less prone to vote or go to the polls either for cultural or other reasons, or because of, say, any number of other circumstances that we could think about, socioeconomic or socio-political variables that might reside outside of the institutional domain. No one's disputing that institutions impact turnout. Clearly, laws regarding mandatory voting, laws regarding the electoral system and how proportional or disproportional it is in its assignment of seats. Obviously, those factors play an important role in a way that we can imagine very easily. But to say that there's no role for cultural or socio-political or other factors is to treat all societies as essentially the same. And it's also to suggest that there should be no change over time. I'm going to return to that in a moment, because remember that a key question is what explains why voter turnout varies across space and across time, because it does vary across time, and changes across time are as important as changes across space. But before we address that, consider turnout among the advanced countries listed here. You'll notice a pattern. Among the countries with the highest turnout, proportional representation is the main electoral system. Proportional representation is a highly proportional electoral system as compared to majoritarianism. So it's less disproportional. And as we would expect, and as Jackman anticipates, these countries have higher turnout, ostensibly because citizens have it in their head that their vote is not wasted if their preferred candidate does not win, because seats are assigned or divvied up according to the proportion 1 in multi-member districts, as opposed to giving the entire constituency to a single winner on the basis of a single member district and winner take all voting. Also notable is the fact that New Zealand has a unicameral. These European countries also have highly competitive districts. Generally speaking, this institutional portrait, it's a good fit when you look at data like this. These countries tend to have many of those institutional features that Jackman anticipates. They also, in many cases, have compulsory voting, or they have laws around compulsory voting. But I want us to pause and think about the limitations of an institutional approach. Institutions are, by definition, static. They are inertial. They stay the same. They function and work the way they do because they perpetuate themselves and because they stay the same. That's what they are. But if they stay the same, they can't explain change in voter turnout across time, because the institutions change very, very little, while voter turnout almost invariably will fluctuate much, much more. And even more than that, if you take a look at some of the best performers like New Zealand, you'll find that even though voter turnout remains relatively high compared to other countries today, voter turnout has declined considerably over time since the mid 20th century. So in New Zealand, the institutions largely stayed the same, but turnout fell from as high as 96%. Isn't that amazing? 96% in the 1940s to about 75% in the 2000 teens. Most recent elections have turnout around the same place. Now, it's even more interesting to consider that in 1993, New Zealand also even switched from single member districts, majoritarian electoral institutions, to a PR system, multi member districts, more proportional, less disproportional. In 1993, about right here. But look, turnout continued to fall and continued to decline. And so these institutional variables are not supple and flexible enough to explain change across time. They just aren't. They're too sticky, they're too static, they're too self perpetuating. Sure, institutional differences help us to understand variation across space, and we can compare countries and very, very easily see those big institutional differences that emerge when we compare them across space. But when you look at individual cases, including those countries that have the highest rates of turnout of all, you'll find that institutions do not adequately explain the change across time. And even more so, the institutional changes that are expected to produce increases in turnout don't actually perform as expected. Otherwise, we would have seen turnout increase right here rather than decrease. So this is important data. And this example is notable because it showcases the limitations of the institutional approach, even as we acknowledge that there is clearly an institutional component to voter turnout. Now, what do you think Jackman is missing in this picture? These are institutional variables and they clearly matter. But what else is going on that isn't accounted for here?
The role of human beings and human action that's taken by people. Like, for example, Stacey Abrams in Georgia getting people to turn out.
Now, you know what Jackman would say, though, right?
That it was because it was a nationally competitive district.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
Okay.
what would you say?
Well, just because it was nationally competitive didn't mean all those people were going to turn out. They're still required to be that person pushing them to turn out in this competitive district.
And you could say that, traditionally Georgia hasn't been a battleground state, right? Like it took human agency to make it highly competitive. It wasn't highly competitive already, or at least, within the time frame that we're looking at for this example. And so I would agree with you that politics and mobilization and human agency and intentionality matter a great deal. There is only one Stacey Abrams. You know what I'm saying? There's only one Stacey Abrams. If Stacey Abrams existed in some form in every state in the union, and if they also had runoff elections, perhaps voter turnout would have been much higher. I think that what this example shows you is that, there's clearly a role for agency, but there's also an institutional component. Because even in that example in Georgia, the presence of a runoff election helped to make it more competitive. You know what I'm saying? Like without that runoff, with just a basic plurality winner take all setup, that election would have been over in November. And so there was an institutional component to that competitiveness of that race. But part of what made it competitive in the first place was the fact that even before November, Abrams and others had mobilized so many and had registered so many new voters. And so there is a political component here. What do the rest of you all think? What else is not accounted for here in this picture painted by Jackman? Well, we are out of time for today, everybody. So I'm going to let you go, and we will continue this on Friday, where we'll get into some more detail and take a look at some cases. We'll have a more detailed discussion and pick up the threads that we left off with here. So thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you on Friday.